Okay, so welcome to the first lecture in Soccer 3666. I'm Steve Threadgold, this is Duncan.
Hi, I'm Duncan McDouira.
What we're going to be doing today is taking you through the content of the first course topic, which is what is consumption and what is technology. So basically we're going to do this in three parts: a quick introduction to consumption, a quick introduction to technology, and in the last section we're going to use the reading about toilet paper to talk through some aspects of consumption and technology. So let's get straight into part one, consumption, the basics. So this course is called Consumption, Technology and Everyday Life. So when we're talking about everyday life here, it's not just, what you think about in day to day. It's actually a conceptual term to think about taken for granted and, making the normal look strange in a way. So the everyday life here is to think about all the kind of things that we take for granted, the multiple paradoxes, the different kind of, decisions, moments, situations that we're in, all of which influence the way that we think, the way that we feel, the way that we interact with others. So thinking about everyday life is asking us in a way to think beyond binaries, beyond the kind of agency structure, public, private, global, local stuff, and to think about how we're embedded in that, and we kind of take a lot of that stuff for granted. Consumption and technology are two key things that kind of structure or influence our everyday life that we take for granted and we don't really think about too much because they're such a central part to how we live. Is that how you would kind of think about everyday life anthropologically? I
think so, and I think everyday life gives you a really interesting viewpoint to then go out and look at all of the different things entangled in our worlds, and for the understanding of individuals, for the understanding of society, for understandings of community, the economy, politics. It's a really interesting vantage point to take, almost from the ground out, and remapping and rewiring. That's all we're really trying to do in this course. If we can bring it back to everyday life, we can then read things with quite a complex lens.
That's right, yeah. So we're looking at consumption and technology as key ways of thinking through everyday life. And in this first part, I'm just going to give an overview of kind of the sociology and in some aspects of the anthropology of consumption. So firstly, the way that we're thinking about consumption here is beyond just eating and drinking. It's kind of, you consume that stuff and that's how you kind of, get the fuel to live. Mm-hmm. But the kind of conceptual social science way of thinking of consumption is much broader than that. Consumption, if you watch a TV show or listen to a song, from a sociological point of view, you're consuming those things as well. So this broadens things out to think about how we, in essence, consumption is at the heart of the way that we think about ourselves, our self-identity, and the way that we think about others, social identities. And it's key to how we relate to others as well, in terms of the distinctions and judgments we make of others. So consumerism, consumption are one of those everyday terms that people use in kind of a common sense way, but sociologically it means more specific things. There's public debates all the time about consumption, where there's overconsumption, where, obesity and heart attack's an issue, not enough consumption, people still have no water and no food. So definitely that's going to be part of the course. But more generally, we're thinking about consumption in this kind of sociological sense as almost a way of life, a lifestyle. So again, is that kind of how you think about it?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. Everything we consume generally has a backstory. So everyday life gives us that viewpoint of when the thing is in our hands or on our screen or in our mouths or in our stomachs, or as we will see later on, in the sewage system. All of that has a backstory, and it has other lives, other everyday lives entangled in it all along the way. And so one of the viewpoints we get from thinking through consumption in everyday life is all of those different stories and all of those different lives and all those different social effects that go into consumption.
Yep. So what this means in some respects is that from some sociological theoretical points of view, people are consumers. We can think of them as consumers. So we can think of people as citizens, as males and females, as working class and middle class, as particular races, particular religions. A broader kind of conception of the actor in society from a sociological perspective is the consumer. And you can see then how all those things I just mentioned, race, class, gender, and things like that, will play a role in the different ways that people consume, the different inequalities that are involved, simply in terms of what's available or what's not, but probably more in the way that we're going to think about it, in the ways that inequalities mean that, some people have a Porsche rather than a Datsun 180B. Some people live on a mansion on Merriweather Beach, some people live in public housing. Women wear pink and men wear blue for some stupid reason from an early age, all these kind of things you would have looked at earlier in your introductory sociology courses. So that's one way of thinking about the consumer. But also we're interested in the consumer as an actor, but also what we'll be looking at in this course more so is the processes of consumption. So we'll be looking at the way that acts of consumption happen in specific spaces. You buy something at a shop, or you might be in bed when you buy something. You can listen to music at a festival, you can listen to music in your car. But there's, as Duncan mentioned already, there's processes that lead up to that point, so we're interested in those. And we're also interested in the kind of consequences of those processes more broadly, what that means in terms of how people live, and what it means for the future, particularly when we start thinking about things like sustainability.
And waste, which we'll talk about later in the course.
Yeah.
And one of the ways technology becomes really crucial in this process is thinking of the ways that it brings consumption to us in a much more rapid, real-time way. So we can consume right now. You can go on your phone and consume something right now. It's become much quicker, much faster. You don't have to go anywhere. The geography of it has shrunk. However, what you order or what you purchase then opens up a different geography of packing, shipping, logistics to bring it to you. So the delay then comes on the receiving side, whereas it's become much more rapid because of our technologies on the purchasing side, which if you think about how capitalism works, that's ideal. Spend the money as quick as you can, and the goods can come later through complex systems of supply. So consumption really animates so much of what happens in the world, but if we think of it from the viewpoint of everyday life, it becomes a bit more manageable. It becomes a bit easier to kind of conceptualize and see.
That's right. Yeah, an example of that in the way technology affects our consumption is that, in the late 90s, I actually camped out overnight to buy tickets for things. But, last night I bought a ticket for a gig at like 10:30 at night from my bedroom. So the progress of that in some ways makes it easier for me, but also in terms of, I didn't have to sit in a chair in the Newcastle Mall for overnight to actually get access to the ticket, but it also means that I can spend a lot more money a lot more quickly. This kind of has obvious effects on the way consumption can happen everywhere all at once now.
And you lose a little bit of that social interaction that I'm sure you got with the other all-nighters waiting to get tickets.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. There's much less social interaction. The process is somewhat dehumanised. I mean, we had a bit of a kind of party when we were camping out that night, and someone lived close, they went and made coffee and brought it, and I met people and stuff. So the sociality of it disappears for convenience, but so we'll be looking at aspects of how technology and consumption interact and how that changes for good and for worse.
Exactly.
So as a third year course, we expect, I suppose, you'll have some understanding of sociological theories and introductions to it. So there's a whole history of the way that consumption and consumer culture and the consumer has been theorised, analysed and thought of. So I'm just quickly going to touch on some of those now. I suppose very broadly, sociology, Marx and Durkheim, and we're particularly interested in the production side of things. Weber comes along and starts thinking more about the everyday status and stuff like that. So we move into the consumer a little bit there. But really they're seen as in the 60s, a consumer turn. The rise of the people at the Frankfurt School and stuff like that who think we're all cultural dupes, ideologically marching to the beat of advertising and the culture industry. Leading up to that, there was people like Veblen who looked at conspicuous consumption and Simmel, the blasé attitudes of the kind of flaneur walking around cities, window shopping. And, more recently, things like semiotics, the kind of analysing of consumer products in terms of what they mean and the cultural aspects of them more so than their use value. Again, the example I use all the time with this is if I hold up a pair of Air Jordans, someone would go, oh, it's so cool, Michael Jordan was awesome. Someone else might go, sweatshop. They very quickly symbolise different things to different people. And there's Bourdieu's kind of work about distinction, the way that we judge others through taste, and the way that we construct a sense of ourselves through the things that we like and don't like, and a sense of others through the things that they like and don't like, and that influences whether we like or don't like them. I suppose all of these things, though, are based kind of somewhat on anthropological ideas of, you know, the gift and the rituals around these things like that. So do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, I think that obtaining, consuming, presenting, giving are all enrolled in status elevation, patronage, and relationship building, often relationships that bind, and so that are reflections of different kinds of social power. So we can go down kind of like a rabbit hole of a lot of that earlier anthropological theory, but what it essentially does is it gives us back our sort of everyday understanding as who has the power to give, receive, and who creates the rituals and social meanings around those kinds of consumption. And then how does it reflect other modes of power? And that will become clearer as the course goes on if you haven't discussed it already in previous courses you might have done. And what I think is interesting about all of the theorists mentioned there is they actually do bring things back to things we can understand and things we've likely experienced in our lives. So we go from a level of abstraction to one of much more sort of everyday enactment and performance that we can identify and either we can remember from having done it ourselves, or we've seen it play out in everyday life. And if you haven't noticed it before, once you've started doing this course, you'll notice it for sure.
Yeah, one of the things in this course we really want to do is kind of make consumption of technology feel strange a little bit.
Yeah.
It's so embedded in our lives, we want to kind of draw out the effects of them in kind of more concrete ways. The other thing I'd like to quickly say about all these theoretical perspectives is, and you'll see a bunch more of them throughout the course, we have a lot of different kind of conceptual things in the course, but we will make an effort to try and teach them through that everyday life stuff as much as possible, so don't worry too much about the complexity of those things. But one thing I find when introducing different theoretical perspectives is students often want to think about which ones are right and which ones are wrong. We don't think that's very useful, because I actually wouldn't put the ideas of anyone up in a course that I think were wrong, per se. Basically, all the conceptual things we'll point out, the different theories and theorists have valuable things to say about aspects of consumption and technology, but they'll be, you know, stronger to think about some things and weaker to think about others. The Frankfurt School, for instance, like, you know, I often think from the Frankfurt School cultural Jew point of view about things in pop culture that I don't like.
Yes.
You know, reality television or shitty pop music or whatever. But, like, you know, not so much with the things I do like, you know, punk and alternative. But from the Frankfurt School point of view, you can't really do that because it's all ideology. But, you know, I would say that Frankfurt School overall has some really strong things to offer us to think about, you know, capitalism and stuff like that. Maybe not so much about the way we live our lives on a day-to-day basis and relate to each other. So, and in the work on Daniel Miller that we'll look at offers aspects of that probably is weaker in the more Frankfurt School sense. So this is a kind of way we'd like you to think about the array of ideas that we present throughout the course. Is they're all kind of useful in their own ways. They all have their weaknesses, and you kind of use them for what they're made for, I suppose. So, finally, in this part of the lecture, I'm just kind of, I suppose, posing here some questions and some things to think about when we use the term consumption throughout the course, and that, I suppose, relates to some of the ideas of the concepts and theories that are on the previous slide. So, in a consumer culture, you know, do we have choice? How much agency do we actually have? When you go to the supermarket, there's, you know, an absolute bucket load of things to choose from, but really, are you choosing between things there, between, you know, packets of pasta in different coloured boxes or whatever? Or are you, as Adorno would say, being offered pseudo-individualised choices there, where you're just provided with choices from, you know, the capitalist system? If you do have choices, and certainly do have some choice, no matter how you look at this, you know, what influence your choices? You know, the things that you like, you know, how much do your parents influence these kind of things, you know, how much your friends and peers in your school open you up to be more acceptable to, you know, having taste for literature or not, or, you know, these kind of things. So we want you to think sociologically about that kind of Bourdieu idea of, you know, your habitus, how this orients you towards the world and opens you up to some things and closes you off to others. So, you know, when we're thinking about choice and we're thinking about identity here, you know, are you what you wear? You know, can you actually express yourself through the things that you choose, like, you know, your clothes, your shoes, the music you listen to? How much of that is actual self-expression, and how much is kind of provided to you by the consumer culture? You know, so some people talk about I consume, therefore I am, kind of stuff, rather than I think, therefore I am. And this is kind of, again, an ideological idea that, like, consumption has taken over our thought and we're largely kind of spoon-fed things. So we can think about here between authentic kind of selves and manipulated aspirations, you know, these kind of dichotomies. They're oversimplified dichotomies, but they're a kind of way of thinking through some of these problems. So our socialisation processes, these leads to our tastes, our lifestyles, our perceptions, things we feel normal and comfortable with, and our perceptions of others. So this is kind of the background sociological thought, I think, that we'll be using to then engage with the other consumption and technology aspects, of course, through it.
And I think it's a really interesting point to think about choice and how we express self, and how technology has altered the audience for that. So in a previous generation, you might have dressed up in an amazing outfit and gone out to be seen, whereas now you can take a photo of that and circulate it digitally around the world. And so the kind of audience and the way in which we kind of try and gain satisfaction about who we are and the consumption decisions we make is being altered and changed by the technologies we use in our everyday life. To what effect, we're not sure, but we hope to equip you with tools in which you can kind of examine and analyse the impacts of those kinds of changes.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll leave this part of the lecture here and move on to technology.